February 19th, 1945 dawned cold and gray over the Pacific Ocean as United States Navy bombardment ships unleashed a thunder that seemed capable of splitting the earth itself. For 3 days, shells had pounded the tiny volcanic island of Iwo Jima, an 8-square-mile speck of black sand and rock that would soon become hallowed ground, purchased with the blood of thousands. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson stood aboard the USS Missoula, watching smoke rise from Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the island's southern tip, like a malevolent guardian. He did not yet know that his name would be forever linked to the most famous photograph of the war, though not in the way anyone might expect. The island's name meant Sulphur Island in Japanese, and the smell of it carried across the water even before the landing craft touched shore. Iwo Jima was needed desperately by American forces. Its airfields would provide emergency landing strips for damaged B-29 Super Fortress bombers returning from raids on mainland Japan, and fighter escorts could refuel there. But to the Japanese defenders commanded by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the island represented the outer defense ring of the home islands themselves. They would not surrender it cheaply. Private First Class James Robeson of the 28th Marines clutched his M1 Garand rifle as his Higgins boat carved through rough seas toward the beach. Around him, other young men from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, and streets in Brooklyn sat in grim silence. They had trained for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare them for what awaited. Intelligence reports had estimated the Japanese garrison at 13,000 men. The actual number was closer to 21,000. And every one of them had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress that existed mostly underground. General Kuribayashi had studied at Harvard and served as a military attaché in the United States. He understood American industrial might and knew that traditional banzai charges and beachfront defenses would only hasten his defeat. Instead, he had ordered his men to dig 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 fortified positions, pillboxes disguised as natural rock formations, and artillery pieces hidden in caves with interlocking fields of fire. The American bombardment, impressive as it was, had barely scratched this subterranean fortress. As the first wave of Marines hit the beach at 0900 hours, they found the volcanic sand nearly impossible to traverse. It was like trying to run through loose gravel. Each step sank ankle-deep into the black grit. For the first minutes, an eerie calm prevailed. Some Marines dared to hope the bombardment had been effective. Then Kuribayashi sprung his trap. From hidden positions across the island, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire with devastating accuracy. The beaches became killing zones where men fell by the dozens, their blood darkening the black sand to an even deeper shade of night. Corporal Tony Stein of the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, had fashioned a unique weapon from a damaged aircraft gun, creating what his comrades called the Stinger. In the first hours of the invasion, he made repeated trips back to the beach to retrieve ammunition and evacuate wounded men, covering their withdrawal with his improvised machine gun. His actions that day would later earn him the Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously after he fell in combat 3 weeks later. His story, documented extensively in Marine Corps historical records, exemplified the extraordinary courage that would be required from ordinary men in the days ahead. February 20th, 1945 brought no relief from the horror that had begun the previous morning. Mount Suribachi loomed over the southern beaches like a fortress, which is precisely what it was. General Kuribayashi had ordered the 550-foot volcanic peak transformed into a citadel, bristling with artillery and machine guns. Every cave had been fortified, every approach covered by interlocking fire. The 28th Marine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge, received the unenviable assignment of taking it. Sergeant Michael Strank led his squad through the nightmare landscape with the kind of steady competence that made frightened boys believe they might survive. Born in Czechoslovakia and raised in Pennsylvania coal country, Strank had joined the Marines before Pearl Harbor and survived the hell of Bougainville. His squad included farm boys and city kids, including a young private from Wisconsin named René Gagnon, who had joined the Marines dreaming of adventure far from his factory town. None of them could have imagined the small role they would play in creating one of history's most enduring images. The fighting around Suribachi defied description. Japanese defenders emerged from hidden spider holes to attack with grenades and satchel charges, before disappearing back underground. American flamethrower teams became priority targets. The Japanese knew these weapons could reach into their caves and bunkers where bullets could not. Casualties mounted with every yard gained. Corpsmen, Navy medics attached to Marine units, worked themselves to exhaustion treating the wounded under fire. Pharmacist's mate John Bradley from Wisconsin moved through the chaos with a courage that belied his quiet demeanor, dragging injured Marines to safety while shells exploded around him. By February 21st, the Marines had isolated Suribachi, cutting it off from the rest of the island's defenders. But isolation did not mean capitulation. The Japanese fought from a network of tunnels and caves, making every position a potential death trap. Marines learned to approach each cave entrance with flamethrowers and explosives, sealing the occupants inside or burning them out. It was brutal, primitive warfare that granted no quarter and expected none. Lieutenant Harold Schreer received orders from Colonel Johnson to take a patrol to the summit when, or if, they finally secured it, and to raise the American flag there. Johnson gave him a small flag that had been brought ashore with the battalion. It measured 54 by 28 inches, salvaged from a ship at Pearl Harbor. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The flag that would fly over Suribachi had survived the attack that brought America into the war. The assault continued through February 22nd with a grinding intensity that wore down even the strongest men. Private First Class Donald Rule from Montana threw himself on a Japanese grenade to save his comrades, becoming one of 82 servicemen who would earn the Medal of Honor during the battle, more than any other single engagement in American military history. His sacrifice, like so many others, went largely unnoticed in the larger chaos of the battle, yet each individual act of valor contributed to the eventual capture of the mountain. As night fell on February 22nd, patrols reported that Japanese resistance on Suribachi was weakening. The Marines had fought their way to the base of the summit. Colonel Liversedge ordered a final push for the morning. Meanwhile, in the tunnels beneath their feet, the remaining Japanese defenders prepared for a last stand. Some wrote final letters to families they would never see again. Others simply waited with whatever weapons remained, determined to kill as many Americans as possible before they themselves died. The mountain had already claimed thousands of lives from both sides. At dawn, it would claim more before yielding its crown to the attackers who had paid such a terrible price to take it. February 23, 1945 began with the same sulphurous dawn that had greeted every morning since the invasion began. Lieutenant Schreer assembled his 40-man patrol from Easy Company at the base of Mount Suribachi, checking weapons and equipment with the careful attention of a man who knew that carelessness meant death. Sergeant Hank Hansen, Corporal Charles Lindbergh, no relation to the famous aviator, and Private First Class Louis Charlot were among those selected. They carried rifles, grenades, and the small American flag that Colonel Johnson had entrusted to Schreer's care. The climb began at 0800 hours. The Marines moved slowly, expecting ambush at every turn. The mountain slopes were pocked with caves and shell craters, any of which might conceal enemy soldiers. Photographers and combat correspondents followed at a cautious distance, knowing that if the patrol reached the summit, the image of the flag raising would be significant. Staff Sergeant Lewis Lowery, a photographer for Leatherneck magazine, stayed close to the lead elements despite the danger. Private First Class James Michaels from Pennsylvania kept his rifle trained on every shadow, every opening in the volcanic rock. The silence was unnerving. After 4 days of constant gunfire and explosions, the relative quiet felt wrong, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Behind him, Private First Class James Robeson, who had survived the initial beach landing that claimed so many of his comrades, wondered if the Japanese had finally abandoned the mountain, or if they were simply waiting for the Americans to cluster together before opening fire. As the patrol climbed higher, they encountered scattered resistance. A sniper here, a small group of defenders there. These were dispatched quickly. The Japanese garrison on Suribachi had been reduced to isolated pockets, their command structure shattered, their ammunition running low. Many chose to die fighting rather than surrender. Cultural context, according to historical analyses published by the United States Marine Corps History Division, emphasized that Japanese military indoctrination considered surrender the ultimate dishonor. This belief would contribute to the battle's ferocity throughout its duration. At approximately 10:20 hours, Schreyer's patrol reached the summit crater. Marines fanned out, securing the area while others searched for something to use as a flagpole. They found a length of Japanese water pipe among the debris and wreckage that littered the mountaintop. As Schreier attached the flag to this makeshift pole, the men gathered around. Below them, the entire southern portion of the island spread out like a map. Beaches still crowded with landing craft, supply dumps, and the organized chaos of an amphibious invasion in progress. The flag went up at 10:30. Schreier, Hansen, Lieutenant Harold Keller, and Private First Class Raymond Jacobs were among those who helped raise it. The moment the stars and stripes caught the wind, every ship offshore began sounding their horns and whistles. Marines across the southern beaches stopped what they were doing to watch the small flag flutter from Suribachi's peak. Men cheered. Some wept. Sergeant Louis Lowry captured the moment on film, though he had to scramble for cover immediately afterward when angry Japanese soldiers emerged from a cave and attacked the patrol with grenades. The raising of the first flag represented more than a military objective achieved. For the Americans fighting and dying on Iwo Jima's black beaches, it symbolized defiance and determination. For those back home, it would become a beacon of hope in a war that had already consumed 4 years and countless lives. But the small flag proved difficult to see from the northern beaches where fighting continued with undiminished intensity. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had come ashore to observe the battle, expressed a desire to have the flag as a souvenir. This request would set in motion a chain of events that would create one of the 20th century's most iconic images and forever change the lives of 6 men who had no idea they were about to become symbols themselves. February 23, 1945, shortly after noon, while the first flag still flew from Suribachi's summit and Marines continued to die on beaches below, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson made a decision that would reverberate through history in ways he could never have anticipated. Learning that Secretary Forrestal wanted the first flag as a keepsake, Johnson reportedly declared that the flag belonged to the battalion and that Forrestal could not have it. Instead, he ordered a larger flag brought up to replace the smaller one. The replacement flag measured 96 by 56 inches, borrowed from a Navy landing craft that had brought it to shore for just such an occasion. Private First Class René Gagnon, a runner for Easy Company, received orders to carry the replacement flag to the summit. The young Marine from New Hampshire climbed Suribachi for the second time that day, wondering what he had done to deserve this particular assignment. He had joined the Marines expecting adventure but found instead a kind of horror that no training could prepare anyone to face. Still, orders were orders, and Gagnon made his way up the mountain with the folded flag tucked under his arm, passing occasional groups of Marines still clearing out isolated pockets of resistance. On the summit, Sergeant Michael Strank organized the flag replacement with characteristic efficiency. His squad had reached the top shortly after the first flag went up, and they were now tasked with raising the second. Corporal Harlan Block from Texas, Private First Class Franklin Sousley from Kentucky, Private First Class Ira Hayes from Arizona, and pharmacist's mate John Bradley joined Strank and Gagnon. They found another length of pipe, this time a piece of Japanese artillery barrel, and prepared to raise the larger flag while simultaneously lowering the first to ensure American colors never stopped flying over the mountain. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had arrived on the summit just minutes before, having made the climb specifically to photograph what he assumed would be the initial flag raising. Finding that he had missed that moment, he positioned himself to capture the replacement flag going up instead. He set his camera, a bulky speed graphic that required careful focusing and timing. There would be no second chance. In that era, photographers worked with film, not digital images that could be reviewed and retaken instantly. Private First Class Harold Schultz from Michigan also participated in raising the flag, though his identity would remain uncertain for decades due to misidentifications in early reports. Corporal Block's identity would similarly be confused for years with Sergeant Hank Hansen, who had helped raise the first flag but was not present for the second raising. These misidentifications would cause pain and controversy for families and veterans alike, demonstrating how even carefully documented historical events can become clouded by the fog of war and human error. None of the 6 men raising the flag understood the significance of what they were doing. To them, it was simply another task in a day filled with danger and death. They could not know that Rosenthal's photograph would be transmitted around the world within 18 hours, appearing on front pages from San Francisco to New York. They could not foresee that the image would become the most reproduced photograph in history, inspiring a postage stamp, a monument, and countless tributes. Most importantly, they could not imagine that 3 of them would never leave Iwo Jima alive, their lives ending in the continued fighting that would rage across the island for another month. February 24, 1945 arrived with no diminishment in the battle's intensity, despite the capture of Mount Suribachi. If anything, the fighting in the island's central and northern regions proved even more savage than the struggle for the mountain. General Kuribayashi's main defensive positions lay ahead, a maze of fortifications that turned every ravine and ridge into a death trap. The Marines who had raised the flags on Suribachi returned to the meat grinder of combat, their brief moment in history already behind them. Their focus narrowed once more to the fundamental problem of staying alive. Sergeant Michael Strank led his squad northward into what Marines had begun calling the meat grinder, a complex of Japanese fortifications that included positions known as the Amphitheater, Turkey Knob, and Hill 362 Alpha. These were not simply defensive positions, but interlocking strongpoints designed to channel attackers into killing zones where hidden artillery and machine guns could massacre them wholesale. Each yard gained cost Marine lives, and each Marine life lost represented someone's son, brother, or husband who would never return home. The Japanese defensive strategy emphasized what Kuribayashi called defense in depth. Rather than attempting to hold fixed lines, his troops operated from concealed positions, allowing Marines to advance past them before emerging to attack from behind. This created a fluid, nightmarish battlefield where front lines barely existed and death could come from any direction. Tank crews found themselves particularly vulnerable. Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes to attach magnetic mines to armored vehicles or threw satchel charges at treads and turrets. Private First Class Franklin Sousley wrote letters home to his mother in Kentucky, trying to describe experiences that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human comprehension without revealing anything that military censors would redact. He told her about the black volcanic sand that got into everything: weapons, food, clothing, and the cold that seeped into bones during night watches. He did not tell her about friends blown apart by mortars or the stench of death that hung over the entire island like a miasma. He certainly did not mention that he had helped raise a flag on a mountain called Suribachi. That seemed too trivial to mention amid so much suffering. By February 26, 1945, Rosenthal's photograph had appeared in newspapers across the United States. The image struck a profound chord with a war-weary public that had endured years of rationing, casualty lists, and anxiety. Here was a picture that seemed to embody American determination and unity. 6 men working together to plant their nation's flag on enemy soil. The photograph became an instant icon, though none of the men pictured in it yet knew of their sudden fame. Communications with frontline units remained limited to essential military traffic. There was no mechanism for telling Private Gagnon or Corporal Bloch that their images were being seen by millions. Corporal Harlan Bloch died on March 1, 1945, killed by a mortar shell while directing fire against a Japanese machine gun nest. He was 21 years old. His family in Texas would not learn of his death for weeks, and when they finally saw the famous photograph in newspapers, his mother immediately recognized her son's physique and posture, even though official Marine Corps identification initially listed Sergeant Hansen in his place. The misidentification would not be corrected until 1947, after Bloch's mother persistently insisted they verify her son's participation in the flag raising. Sergeant Michael Strank died on March 1st as well, killed by the same barrage that claimed Bloch. At 25, he was the oldest of the flag raisers and had served as something of an older brother to his younger squad members. Marines who served with him described a man of uncommon courage and leadership, someone who led from the front and never asked his men to do anything he would not do himself. His death, occurring just 6 days after the flag raising, demonstrated the arbitrary cruelty of combat. One moment a man stands atop a conquered mountain, the next he lies dead in volcanic sand. Another casualty in a battle that would ultimately claim 26,000 American casualties. including nearly 7,000 dead. March 4, 1945 found the Marines grinding forward through the island's northern plateau, fighting an enemy that refused to accept defeat even as the outcome became inevitable. Private First Class Franklin Sousley watched as flamethrower teams advanced on yet another cave system, the terrible weapons belching liquid fire into the darkness where Japanese soldiers waited. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the ever-present sulfur stench, creating an atmosphere that seemed borrowed from medieval visions of hell. Men fought through this landscape day after day, their minds and bodies approaching the breaking point even as they continued to move forward. Private First Class Ira Hayes struggled with demons of a different kind. A Pima Indian from Arizona, Hayes had grown up on a reservation where poverty and discrimination were daily realities. He had joined the Marines seeking to prove himself and serve his country, but the fame generated by the photograph troubled him deeply. He felt uncomfortable being called a hero for raising a flag when so many others had performed acts of far greater courage and received no recognition. When wounded Marines were evacuated from the island and told Hayes they had seen his picture in the papers, he responded with confusion and discomfort, rather than pride. The battle had evolved into a war of attrition that favored the side with more men and resources, which meant the Americans would eventually win, but only after suffering casualties that shocked even hardened military commanders. Naval medical facilities overflowed with wounded Marines. Hospital ships sailed constantly between Iwo Jima and rear area bases, carrying men with horrific injuries, limbs blown off, faces destroyed, bodies burned by flamethrowers or shredded by artillery. Medical personnel worked around the clock, performing triage under conditions that would have been unacceptable in civilian hospitals, but which represented the best possible care under wartime circumstances. Pharmacist's mate. John Bradley continued his work treating wounded Marines despite suffering his own wounds. On March 12, 1945, he was advancing with his unit when Japanese machine gun fire wounded several Marines. Bradley ran forward to help, rendering first aid under fire until he himself was hit by mortar fragments. His injuries earned him evacuation from the island, ending his participation in the battle but saving his life. Years later, he would rarely speak of his experiences on Iwo Jima, deflecting questions from his children and grandchildren. The memories were too painful, the survivor's guilt too heavy. Private First Class Franklin Sousley died on March 21, 1945, shot by a Japanese sniper. He was 19 years old. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death on her birthday, a coincidence of terrible cruelty that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sousley's death occurred nearly a month after the flag raising, during the final grinding days when the Marines were clearing out the last organized resistance. His death, like so many others, accomplished little beyond adding one more name to the casualty lists. The position his unit fought for that day would be taken eventually regardless of whether Sousley lived or died. War operates with an arithmetic that reduces individuals to numbers. The battle entered its final phase as March wore on. General Kuribayashi, who had orchestrated such an effective defense, remained somewhere in the northern caves with perhaps 300 survivors of his original garrison of 21,000 men. American commanders knew the end approached, but also understood that these final defenders would fight with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. Intelligence reports suggested Kuribayashi planned a final banzai charge, a dramatic gesture that might kill some Americans but would certainly result in the death of all remaining Japanese. March 23, 1945, brought reports that groups of Japanese soldiers were infiltrating American lines at night, attempting suicide attacks on command posts and supply areas. These desperate assaults achieved little military value, but demonstrated that even after a month of continuous combat, even after suffering casualties that would have shattered any conventional military force, the defenders of Iwo Jima continued to resist. Every Marine understood that, until the last Japanese soldier either surrendered or died, the island remained a combat zone where death might come at any moment. March 26, 1945, the day American commanders declared Iwo Jima officially secured, arrived with a bitter irony that was not lost on the Marines who had fought for every blood-soaked yard of volcanic rock. The island was secured in the sense that organized Japanese resistance had ended, but scattered groups of holdouts remained hidden in caves and tunnels, emerging at night to attack. Indeed, the final banzai attack came that very night, when perhaps 200 Japanese soldiers, including General Kuribayashi himself, launched a pre-dawn assault on airfield positions held by Army Air Force units and Marine support personnel. The attack achieved surprise and inflicted casualties before being wiped out in brutal close-quarters combat. Captain Dave Severance of Easy Company, 28th Marines, sat among the survivors of his unit and contemplated numbers that staggered the mind. Of the approximately 27,000 Marines who participated in the initial assault, 19,217 had become casualties, a ratio of nearly 3 out of every 4 men hit. The 28th Marines alone had sustained casualty rates exceeding 75%. Companies that landed with 250 men now mustered fewer than 50. The flag raisers themselves embodied these statistics. Of the 6 men who raised the second flag on Suribachi, 3 had died in the subsequent fighting. Private First Class René Gagnon, pharmacist's mate John Bradley, and Private First Class Ira Hayes had survived, though none emerged unscathed. Bradley carried physical wounds from shrapnel and psychological scars from watching Marines die despite his best efforts to save them. Hayes wrestled with survivor's guilt and a growing dependence on alcohol that would plague him for the rest of his life. Gagnon, the least combat experienced of the 3, struggled to reconcile his brief moment, helping raise a flag with the lionization he received when the Marine Corps selected him as one of the heroes to return stateside for a war bonds tour. The War Department recognized the propaganda value of Rosenthal's photograph almost immediately. According to historical records maintained by the Marine Corps University, the image generated unprecedented public response when published. President Harry Truman, who had assumed office only weeks earlier following Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, personally ordered that the 3 surviving flag raisers be brought home to participate in the 7th War Loan Drive. The nation needed heroes, needed symbols of victory to maintain morale and encourage citizens to continue buying war bonds that financed the conflict. Hayes, Bradley, and Gagnon were pulled from their units and sent back to the United States amid ceremonies and celebrations that felt surreal after the horrors of Iwo Jima. They toured the country, appearing at stadiums and rallies where tens of thousands gathered to see the men from the famous photograph. Politicians shook their hands. Celebrities sought their autographs. Newspapers ran profiles describing their backgrounds: the Native American, the Navy corpsman, the kid from New Hampshire. None of the 3 felt like heroes. They insisted repeatedly that the real heroes were the men who had not come home, who lay buried in temporary cemeteries on Iwo Jima or in the Pacific Ocean's depths. The war bond tour succeeded brilliantly from the government's perspective, raising $26 billion. Funds that helped finance the final months of the war against Japan. But for Hayes, Bradley, and Gagnon, the tour represented a different kind of combat, one for which their training had not prepared them. They gave speeches written by others, smiled for photographs, and endured questions from reporters who seemed to imagine warfare as something noble and clean, rather than the chaotic horror they had experienced. Hayes began drinking heavily during the tour, sometimes appearing at events visibly intoxicated, though officials managed to keep this information from the public. August 15, 1945, brought Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Second World War ended with ceremonies aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, where Japanese officials signed surrender documents while Allied representatives looked on. By that date, the airfields on Iwo Jima had served their intended purpose. 24,000 airmen made emergency landings there, aircraft and crew that might otherwise have been lost. Military planners argued that this fact alone justified the battle's cost, though such calculations meant little to the families who lost sons and brothers and husbands on that sulphurous island. November 10, 1954 marked the dedication of the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, a massive bronze sculpture based directly on Rosenthal's photograph. The memorial stood 78 feet high and depicted the 6 flag raisers at larger-than-life scale, forever frozen in that moment of collective effort. President Dwight Eisenhower, himself a military hero, presided over the ceremony where thousands gathered to honor the Marine Corps and all who had served. René Gagnon, John Bradley, and Ira Hayes attended, 3 survivors among the many who wore dress uniforms that day. while memories of Iwo Jima's black beaches haunted their thoughts. Hayes stood before the monument that transformed him into bronze and struggled with emotions that alcohol could no longer fully suppress. He had become famous for a photograph showing him helping raise a flag during a battle where he had performed no extraordinary deeds beyond surviving. The real heroes, he insisted to anyone who would listen, were men like Harlan Bloch, Mike Strank, and Franklin Sousley, men who died on that volcanic island and never came home to see statues erected in their honor. Hayes's drinking worsened after the dedication. He worked various jobs but found it difficult to maintain employment when his alcoholism interfered with work responsibilities. January 24, 1955, brought tragedy when Ira Hayes died at age 32, found in an abandoned hut on the Gila River Reservation in Arizona. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and alcohol poisoning. Hayes had frozen to death after a night of drinking, lying in a drainage ditch where he fell unconscious. His funeral drew little attention beyond local newspapers, though President Eisenhower sent a letter praising Hayes's service. The man who had been elevated to national hero status died in poverty and obscurity, unable to escape the psychological wounds that warfare had inflicted. John Bradley returned to Wisconsin after the war and became a funeral director, deliberately choosing a quiet life far from the publicity that had surrounded him during the War Bonds tour. He married, raised 8 children, and rarely spoke about his experiences on Iwo Jima. When his children asked about the war, he deflected questions or changed the subject. Only late in life did he share limited details, and even then, he minimized his own actions while emphasizing the courage of others. Bradley died in January 1994, having spent nearly 50 years processing trauma that modern medical professionals would diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder, but which his generation simply endured in silence. René Gagnon struggled perhaps most visibly with post-war adjustment. He attempted various business ventures, hoping to capitalize on his fame, but most failed. He worked as a janitor in later years, far from the stadium tours and presidential handshakes of 1945. Gagnon spoke more willingly about his Iwo Jima experiences than Bradley or Hayes, perhaps because he had seen less combat and carried fewer traumatic memories. He remained proud of his service, but frustrated that fame had not translated into lasting success or financial security. Gagnon died in October 1979 at age 54. The identities of the flag raisers themselves became subjects of historical investigation and controversy that extended for decades. The initial misidentification of Corporal Bloch as Sergeant Hansen caused pain for both families. Similar confusion surrounded Private First Class Harold Schultz, whose participation in the flag raising was definitively confirmed only in 2016 through enhanced photographic analysis, 71 years after the event. These identification disputes demonstrated how difficult it becomes to establish historical truth, even when photographic evidence exists, particularly when events occur amid the chaos of combat. Felix de Weldon, the sculptor who created the Marine Corps War Memorial, worked for 9 years to complete the monument. He interviewed the surviving flag raisers extensively, took measurements and photographs, and strived to capture not just the physical appearance of the men, but something of the spirit that drove them up Mount Suribachi. The resulting sculpture became one of America's most recognized monuments, photographed by millions of visitors who come to Arlington to pay respects to those who served. February 19, 2005 marked the 60th anniversary of the invasion of Iwo Jima, bringing together a gathering of elderly veterans who had fought on that volcanic island 6 decades earlier. They assembled on the black sand beaches where they had once charged ashore under withering Japanese fire, now old men with canes and wheelchairs, survivors of a battle that claimed so many of their comrades. Japanese veterans attended as well, including a handful who had served under General Kuribayashi. Former enemies shook hands and shared memories, united by their experience of surviving combat that had tried to destroy them all. The 50th anniversary in 1995 had been larger, attracting thousands of veterans and their families. That commemoration included the publication of James Bradley's book, Flags of Our Fathers, written by John Bradley's son, who had spent years researching his father's experiences and interviewing surviving veterans. The book became a bestseller and was later adapted into a film directed by Clint Eastwood, introducing a new generation to the story of Iwo Jima and the flag raising. The movie, released in 2006, portrayed both the battle and the aftermath with an honesty that previous Hollywood treatments had avoided. Historical scholarship continued to analyze the battle's significance and cost. Military historians debated whether the capture of Iwo Jima justified the casualties. Admiral Chester Nimitz had famously said that uncommon valor was a common virtue among the Marines who fought there. High praise from a man not given to exaggeration. Critics argued that the island could have been bypassed or that alternative strategies might have achieved the same objectives with fewer casualties. Defenders pointed to the 24,000 airmen who made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's airfields, arguing that those saved lives justified the battle's price. The Japanese perspective on the battle received less attention in American historical narratives, but proved equally important for understanding the conflict. General Kuribayashi had known from the beginning that he could not win, that his mission was simply to inflict maximum casualties and delay the American advance toward Japan's home islands. His defense succeeded brilliantly at the former objective. The Americans suffered their highest casualty rate of the Pacific War. Whether the delay achieved strategic value remained debatable, as Japan surrendered 5 months after Iwo Jima fell, driven to capitulation by atomic bombs rather than conventional invasion. Survivors of the battle carried their experiences differently. Some, like John Bradley, maintained strict silence. Others became active in veterans organizations, participating in reunions and commemorations. Many struggled with what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional difficulties that strained marriages and family relationships. The support systems available to modern veterans did not exist for the generation that fought in the Second World War. They were expected to simply resume normal lives as though they had never experienced months of horror and violence. Joe Rosenthal, whose photograph created the iconic image, won the Pulitzer Prize for photography in 1945, the same year he took the picture. He continued working as a photographer for decades, but nothing he ever shot matched the cultural impact of that single image from Suribachi's summit. Rosenthal maintained throughout his life that he had been fortunate to be in the right place at the right moment, and that the real credit belonged to the Marines who fought and died to capture the mountain. He died in August 2006 at age 94, having witnessed his photograph's transformation into a symbol that transcended the specific historical moment of its creation. The battle's 75th anniversary in 2020 brought renewed attention as the number of living veterans dwindled to a handful. By then, only a few men who had fought on Iwo Jima remained alive, all in their mid to late 90s. Each passing year reduced their numbers further, bringing closer the day when the battle would exist only in books, documentaries, and the memories of those too young to have participated. The Marine Corps continued to use the memorial's image in recruiting and promotional materials, ensuring that new generations of Marines understood the heritage they inherited. The iconic photograph itself underwent periodic reanalysis as technology improved. Enhanced digital examination of Rosenthal's negatives allowed historians to identify details invisible in earlier reproductions. These investigations confirmed Harold Schultz's participation and settled other identification questions that had lingered for decades. Such technological detective work could resolve who stood where during the flag raising, but it could not convey what those 6 men felt in that moment, could not capture the fear and exhaustion and determination that drove them up a mountain where thousands of their comrades had already died. The legacy of Iwo Jima extended beyond the battle itself into broader questions about warfare, sacrifice, and national memory. The island remained under American control until June 26, 1968, when it was returned to Japanese sovereignty. The United States retained rights to maintain emergency landing facilities, but the permanent military presence ended. Japanese authorities established memorials honoring their own dead, and the island became a pilgrimage site for families of fallen soldiers from both nations. The black volcanic sand where so much blood had soaked into the earth became neutral ground where former enemies could grieve together. Educational institutions incorporated the battle into curricula as an example of military strategy, tactical innovation, and the human cost of warfare. The United States Naval Academy and the Marine Corps University used Iwo Jima as a case study in amphibious operations, examining what worked and what failed. Students analyzed General Kuribayashi's defensive strategy, which had maximized the defenders' advantages while compensating for inferior numbers and resources. They studied the American combined arms approach that eventually prevailed through the integration of naval gunfire, air support, armor, and infantry assault. These academic analyses reduced human tragedy to lessons learned and tactical principles, a necessary abstraction that allowed military institutions to improve future operations. The controversy surrounding the flag raising itself, which flag mattered, who participated, whether the replacement flag diminished the achievement, seemed to miss the larger point that the men themselves had understood. The flag was a symbol, nothing more. The real story of Iwo Jima was written in the casualties lists, in the Medal of Honor citations awarded to men who threw themselves on grenades or charged machine gun nests, in the exhausted Marines who fought day after day through a landscape that seemed designed by a malevolent god. 6 men raising a flag on a mountaintop made a compelling photograph, but 26,000 casualties told the battle's true story. As the 21st century progressed and the Second World War receded further into history, Iwo Jima remained relevant as both historical event and cultural touchstone. The memorial in Arlington continued to draw visitors who sought connection with a generation that had faced existential threats and prevailed at terrible cost. School groups visited and listened to park rangers explain the battle's context. Veterans of later conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, came to pay respects to predecessors who had fought under different circumstances but shared the fundamental experience of combat. The monument transcended its specific historical moment to become a broader symbol of military service and sacrifice. The photograph itself appeared in context far removed from its original wartime purpose. It was reproduced on everything from postage stamps to commercial advertisements, sometimes appropriately and sometimes in ways that trivialized the sacrifice it represented. Veterans organizations occasionally protested when they felt the image was being exploited for profit or used inappropriately. These disputes reflected broader tensions about how democratic societies remember and honor military service, how they balance respect for veterans with freedom of expression, how they distinguish between commemoration and commercialization. In the final accounting, the Battle of Iwo Jima demonstrated both the courage of individuals and the horror of modern warfare. It showed what human beings could endure and accomplish when driven by duty, loyalty, and determination. It also revealed the terrible price extracted by military conflict, the way warfare consumed lives and left survivors psychologically scarred. The men who raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, both the first flag and the famous second one, were ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary circumstances. They did not seek fame or recognition. They simply performed their duties as they understood them, in conditions that would have broken many others. The battle ended in March 1945, but its echoes continued through subsequent decades. Every February 19th brought remembrances and ceremonies, smaller each year as fewer veterans survived to attend. The families of those who died on Iwo Jima kept their memories alive, passing stories to children and grandchildren who never knew the young men who had marched off to war and never returned. The island itself reverted to its pre-war obscurity, a volcanic speck in the Pacific Ocean that most people could not locate on a map despite its place in history. Yet for those who fought there, for the families who lost loved ones there, and for the nation that sent them there, Iwo Jima remained sacred ground, 8 square miles purchased with blood and courage, forever linked with a photograph of 6 men raising a flag on a conquered mountain.